Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our final day of Virtual Reunion Week 2020. We are so excited to have the members of the classes of 2010, 1995, and 1970 here with us this morning, celebrating this unique milestone in your SAIS history. I want to share with you, before we get started with today's programming, a few housekeeping rules that will be helpful to keep us on track this morning and ensure that everyone gets an opportunity to engage and interact. So we ask that you please add in the chat your name, your class year, your current location or SAIS affiliation, just to let people know that you are here and in the room. We will start today's program with remarks from our Board of Advisor leadership, from your class chairs, your class committee chairs, and then we will go immediately into our faculty panel, which we're really excited about. At the conclusion of the question and answer section of the panel presentation, we will go into a very brief break, and then we will return for the 50th class medallion presentation and your class social breakouts. So I will make an announcement at the conclusion of the panel program for you to join us with that second link. There's a second Zoom link that you would have RSVP'd for the social component of our programming today. So again, we'll put some of these reminders in the chat. I'll come back and I'll make some verbal commentary to you all, but I just want to say thank you again for joining us. We're really excited. This week has been really great seeing you all get to reconnect, come back to SAIS and learn more about the school and where we're headed and how you guys can be of support of that, and seeing you again have these significant moments with your peers. So with that, I won't talk too long. I know we have other people here who you're really excited to hear from, so I will turn that over now to our Chair of the Board, Marijke Jurgens-Dupree.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this SAIS reunion. Unfortunately, it's virtual and not in person, because I'd love to be sitting down with a glass of wine with all of you. My name's Marijke Jurgens. I'm a proud member of the class of 1992, and I'm the current Vice Chair of the SAIS Board of Advisors. Firstly, many, many congratulations on your 10th, 25th, and 50th reunion years. These milestones are significant to us all, and it's very important to everyone at SAIS to recognize and celebrate each of these milestones. I do remember my 25th class reunion a few years ago, where it was wonderful to reconnect with my peers and to wonder why and how these years have just flown by. Over the past couple of years, as I've become more involved with SAIS and the Board of Advisors, I've greatly enjoyed seeing the school's development and watching new generations of students as they all become SAIS Mafia. I hope that the activities around this virtual reunion have given you greater insight into the changes that are occurring at the school under Dean Cohen's leadership, especially our relocation to 555 Penn. If you don't know the building, it's a magnificent space within striking distance of the Capitol. It's I couldn't have found a better building for SAIS to be the anchor tenant. And I do hope that very, very soon we'll all celebrate there in person. I believe we're moving in 2024. Now, let me take a brief moment to acknowledge the support of the school from all three classes through the success of each class fundraising initiative. Additionally, many thanks must go out to those of you that are Christian Herta Society members who give to the school at the level of $2,500 or above. Francisco Vasquez Awid, Kevin Carr, our former dean, SAIS Dean, Dr. Jessica Einhorn, Jefferson Finch, David Frey, Carrie Cullen-Hitt, Robert Maloney, Julie Holm-Mischeit and Zachariah Mischeit, and Susan von Schild. Your generosity provides funding that's critical to the future of SAIS, to our students, and also in support of the Dean's priorities. I'm looking forward to the program today that will celebrate each of these classes. Today, we will hear from your 2010, 1995, and 1970 class leaders. We're going to engage in a discussion with current faculty on the effects of the pandemic on global relations and the rise of nationalism versus the decline of globalism. We'll also recognize the 50th class with their Johns Hopkins Alumni Association medallion ceremony before we end with class social breakouts. Now let me turn this podium over to the 50th class committee chair, Olga Grkavac, and Bob Maloney.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. It's such an honor, and I want to welcome everyone for participating in our class reunion today and all the activities during these challenging times. I am Olga Grkavac, and with my committee member, Bob Maloney, it was such a pleasure for us to work with the staff, the excellent staff, on reaching out to our colleagues and to help shape some of the programs. We are the class of 1970. It's really hard to believe it's been 50 years since we left the walls of SAIS. It was a turbulent time and a lot of social change. That hasn't changed. We faced a world with the Vietnam War still escalating. The first Earth Day had been scheduled, and the Beatles had announced their breakup. Social change continues to be a major theme. As part of our reunion activities, Rosemary Traynor, our philanthropy liaison, will be contacting all of us to discuss some options for fundraising and our class gift. Rosemary and all of the SAIS staff have been just a joy to work with. Bob and I would like to thank all of our classmates who participated in the reunion activities, and a special thank you to Ambassador Dick Erdman for his wonderful art tour last week that kicked off our celebration. We are looking forward to the panels today, and of course, of special interest to all of the class of 1970 is the very moving medallion ceremony later today. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to David Frey with the class of 1995.
Thank you, Olga. Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. It's a real honor to have had the chance to chair the 1995 SAIS Reunion Committee. I want to begin by thanking my co-committee members who did just a totally awesome, stupendous, unbelievably over-the-top job of getting everyone excited for this. Those members are Barbara Kochvar, Scott Wilkerson, and Laurie Blank. Just really, some of them I knew well, some of them I knew less well, and we really came together, and with the support of the SAIS Reunion administration team, had a great time doing this and executing the program this year. It's especially heartwarming to be together this morning with such a nice turnout despite all of the challenging times. Some of the folks here know I'm dealing with my own version of these challenging times, having just got my dad out of Estes Park and Rocky Mountain National Park, which if you're following the national news is in some very tough forest fires at the moment. And I know that people around the nation and the world from these SAIS classes and the SAIS body at large are dealing with just unprecedented challenging times in the pandemic and other things going on. In preparing for this week's activities, the committee members we have all really been heartened by the instant connections and warmth that we felt as we went through the preparation activities and reached out to people and had that sort of instant SAIS reconnection spark that is such a part of the SAIS experience. The unlimited lifetime warranty, as I heard Dean Cohen refer to it the other day. In particular, I think we've just had such a good time actually following through on all of this all of this very deep planning exercises as we went through 2 events this week thus far, with beginning hearing from 9 SAIS students and culminating as we went through and heard from the students just how, if I were to apply for admission today, I'm not sure I could get in comparing myself to the 9 students that we heard from this week. And the really fantastic thing about that session was the way at the end of it, there were reunion class members, particularly from 95, but from all of the classes really jumping out of their seats to offer more connection, more support directly to the students, to the dean, and to the school. It was really fantastic to see that. Hearing from the dean himself about SAIS Reimagined, in particular the life design element of what had been really anachronistically referred to as career services, and perhaps even anachronistically oriented. I think the life design presents an incredible differentiation opportunity for the SAIS community and Hopkins at large as the university and SAIS move forward implementing that. And then of course, the social committee where our very own Scott Wilkerson chaired for all the classes, a mixology class that got us going with his version of the world's best margarita. And then a just fantastic roundtable where we had 35 or 40 people catch us all up within 30 seconds or 45 seconds on their activities around the world. So with that, I would like to pass now to my fellow reunion organizing committee member, Laura Lombard, also a fellow University of Kansas graduate as it happens, and a current congressional candidate who's taking time away from her busy schedule. Laura.
Thank you, David, and I'm glad to hear that your family in Estes Park, I did see the news, and I'm glad to hear that they're okay. Good morning, everyone. I am Laura Lombard. I'm the class of 2010 reunion committee chair. First thing I'd like to do is thank Dean Cohen and the SAIS Development and Alumni Relations team for really pushing on to organize this reunion, even despite the pandemic and all the challenges that it brings. I'm sure that we'd all like to be in person and as one of our earlier speakers said, enjoying a glass of wine together, but we will in the future, and we look forward to that. And I also want to thank the entire 10th reunion committee chair, or committee rather, for all of their hard work. The folks on that committee include Ted Alcorn, Kevin Carr, Francisco Vasquez Ahuid, and Kathleen Monticello. We have all been delighted to be part of this first ever virtual reunion week. It's been wonderful to hear from Dean Cohen about the state of the school, hear from our current students about their experiences with internships, experiential learning, growing their careers. This is a moment for all of us, though, to reminisce about our experiences that we've had at SAIS. And I encourage not only the class of 2010, but everyone who's on this call to really share what you've learned this weekend with all those who couldn't attend for various reasons around the world. Let's do our part in building excitement beyond the reunions and well into next year. And hopefully we'll be back together next year in person to celebrate on Massachusetts Ave and further down the road at Pennsylvania Avenue as well. We appreciate your enthusiastic support for Johns Hopkins SAIS and your commitment to making an impact for its future. In addition to the financial support that many of you gave, there are other ways to stay engaged with the school. One, you can partner with the admissions to recruit and recommend prospective new students. Partner with career and student services to offer internships, career treks, become a mentor, or provide workshops to students. And then, of course, attend SAIS events all around the world. As Dean Cohen said, we have that limited lifetime warranty. So if there are events going on, then let's all show up and be part of that. Again, thank you to all of you, and particularly to the class of 2010. Let's continue to celebrate our past and look forward to the future. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vice Dean of the Faculty Affairs, Andrew Mertha, to start our panel.
Thank you so much, Laura, and congratulations again to the classes of 1970, 1995, and 2010. My name is Andrew Mertha. I'm Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs and International Research Cooperation. I also wear a couple other hats. I'm the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies and the Director of the China Studies Program. It is really my privilege to be able to moderate a panel of my colleagues and friends this morning. And I'm just going to introduce them to you and jump right in because our time is limited, and I want to spend the morning talking about substance rather than simply going into titles and things like that. So I am joined by Carla Freeman, who is the Associate Research Professor of China Studies and the Executive Director of the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. Professor Lisel Hintz, Assistant Professor of International Relations and European Studies. And by Devesh Kapur, Starr Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies and the Director of Asia Programs. And our topic this morning is COVID-19 and global relations, nationalism, and globalism. And what I'm going to do is I've got some questions that we have formulated, as well as some that the audience has provided, both prior to this event and also hopefully in real time. And I'm going to try to get through as many of those as possible. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to answer, I guess in the order in which I've introduced them, which is alphabetically, but also to jump in if they'd like to respond to something that one of the other panelists has said. So again, in the interest of time, let me just jump right into it. First of all, the first question that I have is, what are the most common observations about the pandemic? Is that it has acted as an accelerant for existing trends, not necessarily as a change agent. Has that held true for your area of expertise? And if so, or if not, how so and how not? So Carla, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you, Andy. Just want to make sure everybody can hear me. Thanks so much for having me, and I have to thank the SAIS Development and Alumni team for organizing this. I graduated with my MA from SAIS a few years before the class of 1995, but I was in the midst of the SAIS PhD that year, and for the class of 2010, I was already teaching at SAIS that year, so it's great to have Laura Lombard and students from that year with us. Sorry we're not able to get together in person, but it really is wonderful to have this virtual chance to get together. So on your question, Andy, that's a big one. There's a lot one could say about the impact that COVID-19 has had on China and on impelling various trends within China. China is already seeing signs of substantial economic recovery, but the recovery is very uneven, what's sometimes described as K-shaped. Those at the lower 2/3 of Chinese household incomes, especially those involved in export manufacturing and many in the service sector, many migrant laborers to large cities, for example, have been hit really, really hard. And so the pandemic is exacerbating income inequality in China as it is and has been globally. You can also point to the strengthening of the hand of the party state over society as a result of the restrictions on individual activities associated with COVID. There's including an expanded use of big data systems to track people and so on. And then in the weak United States response to the virus might also accelerate the trend toward China's economic rise to replace the US as the world's largest economy sooner. That had been expected sometime in the middle of the next decade. And now there are estimates that it could even happen as early as the end of this one. I don't know how much time I had. I thought I might share a few thoughts about the impact of the pandemic on US-China relations. Should I continue and make a few more comments?
Sure, go ahead, Carla.
Okay. Of course, the US-China relationship is becoming more and more strained, both over geopolitical factors, also differences in values and worldviews. And this is a trend that's been in play since the Obama-Biden administration, at least. And members of the Trump administration, of course, took office ready to deploy a much more muscular, in-your-face approach to resetting the relationship in a whole number of dimensions, principally in the area of trade imbalances and intellectual property. they didn't rule out cooperation coming in, as indeed cooperating on a major mutual strategic concern. North Korea's nuclear program was one of the areas that Trump and Xi had discussed early in the Trump administration. But the U.S.-China relationship has been growing increasingly estranged and hostile, both on the economic and geopolitical fronts over the last few years. And there's growing concern in the United States about Chinese intentions, including the exploitation of America's open society and China's growing international influence. Amid some policies, particularly those affecting human rights in China, that raise a lot of that really hit our national concerns. And China, for its part, is increasingly concerned about what it sees as U.S. constrainment and interference in domestic affairs. So it's often incorrectly stated. I mean, maybe this was an idea propagated by President Kennedy, that the characters in Chinese for crisis also mean opportunity, but the word crisis, I guess, does appear in the word opportunity. But it's often these crises that provide critical junctures for change. And really, one would have expected that even amid this growing estrangement and intensifying maybe security dilemma, that the pandemic would create an opportunity for bilateral cooperation between the two countries. Certainly during the 2009 pandemic, there was cooperation between the United States and China that really helped to mitigate that pandemic and actually helped develop a vaccine. And at the outset of the crisis, it looked like Trump was given his early praise for Xi's crisis management, that he was going to build on this longstanding tradition. But instead, the pandemic has proved to be a factor that's further strained the U.S.-China relationship and actually is accelerating the downward spiral in U.S.-China relations. I guess I want to just say that this has really terrible implications for the ability to manage the pandemic globally, particularly the U.S., in my view, the U.S. withdrawal from the WHO on grounds that it had become a tool of Beijing, and then our poor performance in managing the pandemic domestically. This has given China much more opportunity to expand its role in international health leadership, and that's fine, but unlike the past, the U.S. is not involved, and viral and vaccine competition over the distribution of vaccines looks like it's a new emerging trend, and that's really unfortunate. Fortunately, China has joined COVAX, but the United States has not. So in short, I don't want to take up too much time because there are so many other experts here, but in my view, a couple of bad things. One, U.S.-China tensions are a drag on global economic recovery, and we can discuss this more in future. Second, there's an increased geopolitical risk from U.S.-China strains, and this also has a dragging effect on economic recovery because it's harder for investors to make decisions. They don't want to get caught up in the U.S.-China security competition. And thirdly, directly related to global health, global cooperation, sharing information, sharing knowledge, best practices, and coordinating policies. This is all key to building an effective global system, to managing global health. And we know that in managing global disease, we're literally collectively only as strong as our weakest link. And as long as there are people who can get and spread the disease, we're all vulnerable. And so we really need to cooperate in order to strengthen our responses to epidemics and pandemics globally. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Carla. Same question to you, Lisel.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andy. Good morning, everyone. This is my fourth year at SAIS, and I think this is my third alumni panel. So I always find these events really fulfilling and gratifying and extremely well organized. So I'm really glad that we were able to make this happen. On that great question of has the pandemic exacerbated existing trends or has it reversed trends? As any good, well-trained comparativist political scientist, I have to say that it depends on the issue area of question and the cases that we're looking at. So if we're looking at, for example, economic growth and decline, we saw that the pandemic, reversed economic growth, gains on combating poverty in a number of situations. But in the country that I study, which is Turkey, Turkish domestic politics and foreign policy, what we saw was the pandemic and the economic lockdown, which actually was quite a bit less than we saw in other countries. I'll talk super briefly about that. Really exacerbating what was already a very steep period of economic decline in Turkey. And that's due to a number of factors, existing structural factors, demographic factors, really unorthodox monetary policy, prioritizing low interest rates over everything, and trying to keep an economy going, and keep electoral support for the party that's ruling over that economy by pushing hot money into the economy and depleting foreign reserves. So, we've seen, for example, just this week, the lira kind of hovered around 8 to the dollar, which is an all-time low. You have unemployment and inflation at all-time highs. So you really see the pandemic as exacerbating these existing trends. And what's interesting is that, as I said, the government actually tried to prioritize economic growth during the pandemic, or try to safeguard economic growth, looking at the policies that were put in place that from a public health perspective were pretty questionable, included curfews only on those under 20 and over 65. So obviously allowing the workforce to continue. As Carla mentioned very briefly, we also see this as an opportunity for already authoritarian regimes of various natures. When we're speaking of Turkey, we often consider it a competitive authoritarian regime. That is, elections take place, but the playing field is very skewed and the ruling party rules with a very strong executive authority. This was certainly the case as well. In terms of being able to increasingly consolidate its power, one element you saw was the Turkish Medical Association, which was extremely frustrated with Turkey's handling of the pandemic and the lockdown, as well as, frankly, the reporting of numbers. It turns out that the Turkish government was only reporting cases in which people were sick and not cases in which people tested positive. And so that obviously has huge implications for where Turkey places on the international scale, and all with consideration of how investors are considering Turkey. So the political and the economic and the public health are very intricately tied. The Turkish Medical Association spoke out very vociferously against this. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan called the head of the Turkish Medical Association a terrorist, and basically is looking at legislation to reduce the influence and the autonomy of the Turkish Medical Association. So those are two trends that were already sort of in play that we saw exacerbated by the pandemic. Because Carla mentioned US-China relations, I can end with a super brief anecdote about US-Turkey relations that actually shifted the dynamic. So US-Turkey relations, I would say, are at pretty much an all-time low, and that's saying a lot because we've had a number of tensions over Cyprus, over the Iraq War in 2003, and not allowing access to Turkish air bases and so forth. But you have a number of issues that are creating a lot of tension in the US-Turkey relation, and at the top of that is Turkey's purchase as a NATO member of an S-400 missile defense system from Russia that is not compatible with NATO technology, first of all, and also threatens to compromise intelligence on the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program. So this has been a huge issue of tension, and despite many, many repeated threats to sanction Turkey over this purchase, the power to sanction essentially falls in the hands of the president, and President Trump has not seen fit to apply those sanctions. But one thing the pandemic did actually provide was a period of détente in these tensions, because the Turkish government said that they were going to hold off on activating the system. So they took possession of the missiles in July of last summer, which was already crossing a red line for the US. And then the new red line is if they actually activate the system. And they were able to say, well, because of the pandemic, we're going to sort of hold off on that. Obviously, considering the potential threat of sanctions, considering the economy already hindered by the pandemic. But we saw a reversal of that last week with a test of one of the missiles of the system. So it looks like we're back to a period of immense tensions. But I thought that the pandemic, sort of as an excuse to hold back on activation, was really interesting, because obviously the Turkish military was involved in a lot of other activities. It wasn't like the pandemic was really leading the the period of non-activation. But again, as I said, we're back to high tensions there in the Eastern Mediterranean and elsewhere.
Fascinating. Thank you, Lisel. Devesh, the baton is passed to you.
Thanks, Andy. I'll answer your question with respect to one of my areas of expertise, which is international migration. Basically, we know that international mobility in all forms has dropped very sharply, whether it's for tourism, for business, for workers, and we are beginning to see that for international students. Migration flows to OECD countries have dropped by about at least half in the first half of this year, relative to the last 2 years. And this has had a major impact on developing countries because international remittances are projected to drop by about $100 billion this year. And this is largely to poor countries which are already reeling from the economic effects of the downturn. So it's going to be a big hit for poor countries and poor families. One silver lining is that it has, I think it has put a brake on a trend in many Western democracies, which is the political backlash and nationalism that had come from international migration that was manifest in events like Brexit and the election of President Trump in 2016. I mean, one of the interesting things about this election cycle in the US is immigration is hardly an election issue. Relatively compared to 2016. And that's, of course, because pressures at the border and international migration like the US has dropped very, very sharply. One thing that affects us as a higher education institutions is its implications for international students. There are about 4 million international students in the world. About 6 out of 10 of all international students are from Asia, led of course by China. Because household incomes are going to decline because of the economic stresses, so the ability to pay will be less, so the sort of supply of students will be less. Because of, at least in the US, international students peaked in about 2015-16, the flow, and it's dropped by about 10% last year. We're going to see, the declines, which will be even more. And of course, because of the, as Carla said, the greater contentiousness in the relationship with China and the US, we're likely to see a further drop from students from China. So we're probably going to see fewer international students in the global system and a relocation within Asia and to Europe. Of course, this could all change if you have a Biden administration, if economic growth comes back sharply, but I'm a little doubtful on that. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Devesh. Just to add anecdotally to maybe to what Carla was saying, one of the things that I'm hearing from people closer to the ground is that one possible effect of COVID is a greater demand to want to join the Chinese Communist Party in China because it offers career stability. So it'll be really, really interesting to see if that happens, and if so, what kind of effects that's going to have in terms of meritocracy on the one hand versus possibly kind of an expansion of or dilution of it as an institution, what the prospects that would have for everything that Carla laid out so nicely. So what I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists to talk about to identify one, at most two, of what the biggest threats to stability, so defined, broadly defined, that have come from the pandemic. And Carla, I'd like to start with you if I can.
Sure. See if I can come up with two. There are many, but just to just sort of start off again to focus on the U.S.-China relationship that we used to talk about is so critical to the world, to global stability. Worsening tensions there are really contributing to a very damaging international environment, and particularly in the context of the pandemic. And I think, we'll look back when this is history to the cost to human life that resulted because of the failure to do a better job cooperating, and especially on the production and distribution of a vaccine. And I'm hoping that's not the history we actually live, that we actually change that. But there are many threats. I mean, I think, again, the pandemic is exacerbating inequalities, as other panelists have said, between the have and have-nots in society. I mean, something like 400 million jobs have been lost globally by some counts. And again, those losses are heaviest among the lower wage workers. And so this is just going to widen inequality within societies, and also the gap between rich and poor countries globally. And so we've also seen, we can't ignore that we've seen so much damage to social fabric, not only from the inability to engage in community activities, but also from the loss of key family members and so forth. And all of that's going to add new strains atop the economic costs from the global pandemic. And I think we should expect this is going to increase the risks. It's going to increase social instability. And then political stability has also been challenged by the pandemic, with some risks that I think, as a democratic society, we're seeing, play out in real time, real risks to democracy. I mentioned before Xi Jinping, or at least I mentioned China's use of the crisis to expand control over society. In some places, this is actually contributing to rising political violence against repressive governments, but also governments themselves are using their new power they're using violence against those who threaten their political control. And so I think this will contribute, this is not my field, but this will contribute to the erosion, I think, ultimately in political trust in government authorities in societies. And I think this is going to exacerbate governance challenges around the world in many societies and increase political instability. And again, just to end, I think we are also at a moment when I wrote an article about the Kindleberger trap, drawing on Joseph Nye's work. But against this backdrop, we really have a vacuum in global leadership. The US in its America First moment has pivoted away from multilateralism and sort of suggested that it lacks the capacity to provide a global leadership role. And China has offered contributions to try to address things, but there's limited trust around the world for its role for a number of reasons, and also because it just doesn't have a good doesn't have much of a track record. So we're in a situation where there's no so-called system stabilizer in a global crisis, and our international institutions, many are trying, but they just cannot match the role that the US has played over the past 7 decades or so in the global system.
Yeah, there really is no identifiable lender of last resort now, is there? So it's this is a fraught time. Lisel, same question to you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the way that Carla mentioned sort of the different ways in which we think of stability and the different populations that are affected, because I think often we tend to think of, global stability, regional stability, security sector, all that kind of stuff. But, I think it's also really important to emphasize what she touched upon in terms of the structural inequalities that are producing very different outcomes when it comes to COVID infections and COVID deaths. And, maybe the case that we know the best in the US, of course, significantly affecting people of color in terms of their concentration in urban areas where pandemic effects tended to be the highest and most concentrated, not able to work from home, using public transportation more frequently, structural inequality in terms of comorbidities like obesity and heart disease and things that come along with not being able to have access to healthy foods, not having access to healthcare and so forth. So, that's the US case that maybe a lot of us know the best, but that also is sort of mirroring demographic differences that we see in other countries. And one of the issues that I think is really important that I want to touch on, because Devesh mentioned immigration, is the Syrian migrant situation in Turkey. There are more Syrians in Turkey than in any other country. Turkey's hosting about 4 million Syrians, the great majority of which are not in the refugee camps that are along the borders, but are, I think, 90+% have sort of migrated out of those and towards urban areas, particularly in Istanbul. And so again, the lack of access to healthcare at the concentrated urban areas where they're living and so forth are really structurally affecting them in terms of the kinds of effects that they're seeing from the pandemic. Kind of moving up to the global stability question, I think that there is a situation in which you have countries that, or leaderships that are having to focus so much on their own domestic issues that they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to be able to engage as much in solving diplomatic crises as they might. Although I would also mention that I think, under the Trump administration, the US has really pulled back from its role as mediator in a lot of those situations. And I think the Eastern Mediterranean is a really good example of that. You see under Recep Tayyip Erdogan's administration in Turkey, again, a concentration of power in the executive, as well as an increasingly activist and aggressive foreign policy that primarily comes from him. And so when you have these domestic concentrations of power in the hands of an individual and who is able to make these decisions with relatively few audience costs to restrain them, you see these activist, aggressive foreign policies, Turkey's incursions in Syria, in Libya, now in Nagorno-Karabakh, and also in terms of the gas or hydrocarbon drilling that's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean, to which NATO members are objecting very strongly. We just had Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, proudly announce that Greece and Turkey had, they were going to hold off on any kind of military activities, particularly during their days of national celebration, that is October 28th and 29th. And right after that, Erdogan announces military activities for October 28th, one of Greece's national holidays. So, you have a relatively unrestrained Turkey, partially because I think countries have been dealing with their own domestic issues, but also because you have this concentration of power in the hands of one individual who has very broad aspirations for Turkey's role in the region.
Thanks, Lisel. Devesh, do things look any better in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, just in sort of two ways to answer your question. One is, I think, in general, in developing countries, the worst is yet to come. The economic downturn is going to go on for a while. Where I am most apprehensive is a very sharp increase in unemployment, coupled with increases in economic nationalism. And I think what we see is that when you have a severe economic downturn, government revenues are sharply dropping, even while the demand for government expenditures is sharply increasing. Most poor countries do not have the fiscal firepower. Foreign aid is going to be very limited because rich countries are faced with their own internal challenges. And I think this combination of severely increasing unemployment with very limited fiscal firepower will really play itself out next year. And I fear a sharp increase in social unrest in many poor countries. In the Indo-Pacific, I think something that I'm following is the standoff in the Ladakh plateau between India and China. There are now 100,000 troops facing each other. It's going to be about 20 to 30 degrees Celsius below zero within the next month. And this is going to go on. We see a much more aggressive China that is playing itself out from Australia to Japan to India and other countries. As you may know, the Quad, which had been dormant since Australia and India were very reluctant to antagonize China. And I think they have found that that has actually made China even bolder. So for the first time since 2007, the navies of US, Japan, Australia, and India will be having exercises called the Malabar exercises. We don't know where this is going to go. Pompeo has called for Asian NATO. I am very skeptical that the Quad will morph into one. But it's very clear that the chances of miscalculation in Ladakh are very high, and that could really sort of become a sort of major clash. Just because when you have 100,000 troops in such close proximity and so heavily armed, the chances for mistakes are always there. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Devesh. So we're got about just under 10 minutes left, and what I'd like to do is hopefully balance this conversation, or at least mitigate some of the things that we've been talking about, or flesh them out by asking the question of, is there anything good that has come out of this pandemic? Or, and maybe one of the things, might be prospects of their global cooperation in kind of non-traditional areas, or kind of unexpected quarters. But really the question that I'd like to ask each of you is there anything good that has come out of this pandemic that we might be able to kind of work with, exploit, mobilize, what have you? Carla?
Well, I think you took the words that I'd planned to say, basically just focus on. I think we have seen once again that cooperation is really important. And I think that lesson is something that we will take away from this terrible experience. Last time we had a global conflagration, it was an opportunity to build new institutions, and I'm hoping we will see that again. I think we've also learned from some success stories in Taiwan and New Zealand and even in Korea and South Korea as well, that you can manage a pandemic with technocratic approaches. And what you need, though, is you need planning, and you need to have a contract with your people about how much they are willing to, government intrusion they're willing to accept. And when you have that arrangement, when you have that agreement, you can do a lot to address even a potentially catastrophic disease like we have in COVID-19 with a fair amount of success. This story isn't over yet, but it does look like there's some great takeaways from some success stories in the pandemic. Stop there.
Thank you, Carla. Lisel, same question to you.
Yeah, again, I would pick up on what Carla said and say, looking at some of those success stories, New Zealand in particular, and look at the role of women leaders. If you look at a lot of the countries that have handled this in an effective way, a lot of those are led by women. So I think that's something that's very encouraging. I think another aspect, and I hesitate to emphasize this because I am someone who firmly believes in the power of in-person, face-to-face teaching and the role of the classroom and how integral that is to building community and having the opportunity for spontaneous conversations and getting feedback from students and all that. But I think one aspect that is positive, as long as it doesn't replace in-classroom education, is that, we've been able to, zoom into our friends' classes and give talks. We've been able to sort of have this new norm of the boundaries to, the travel boundaries that would normally be associated with giving a guest lecture aren't necessarily there. And the more that we as faculty members and members of educational institutions get used to this kind of interaction, I think that that opens up a lot of possibilities. Again, I really firmly want to underscore that I'm afraid of the trends that might open up, of a Pandora's box of just, oh, everything can be online, let's have it that way, it cuts costs. Because I firmly, again, believe in the power of face-to-face education. But I think that these opportunities to make those kinds of connections and share those stories and create that kind of intellectual collaboration has been something really important.
I'd just like to endorse what Lisel said, on both counts, but maybe I'm a little bit less risk averse, so kind of sticking my neck out there, because for me, really, I found this to be an opportunity to readdress or reassess kind of assumptions that I had made about communications, about education, and about transmission of ideas and just interactions more generally. I do hope that we don't go back to just looking at efficiencies, as the thing that's going to guide us, but rather, what is the most effective kind of set of platforms? And I think, again, I think a big tent, is what we should be looking for in terms of, diversity in the, the educational, both intellectual and policy related ecosystems. But I do think that is something that we will see the benefits of, or I hope to see the benefits of, kind of accrue over time, as long as we're very careful about managing it, as Lisel, I think, very wisely points out. Devesh, you have the penultimate word before I close up our panel. So is there anything good that can come from this pandemic from your vantage point?
I think the single biggest good to come out of the pandemic will be in 2 weeks in the US elections. I think we are likely to see that COVID was history might show that it was the single biggest reason that led to an election outcome that would not have happened or is unlikely to have happened if it had not occurred. That has major consequences. That election will have major consequences, not only for democracy in the United States, for the United States leadership in the world, and it generally will bring a larger message that competence matters, that technical expertise matters, and it puts a certain limit on the popularity of populism that has swept around the world.
I strongly endorse.
Thank you, Devesh. Thank you, Lisel. Carla, any?
No, I think that was beautifully said. Thank you for articulating that, Devesh.
It's going to be hard for me to top that, so I'm not even going to try. What I will try to do, though, is just first of all, thank our panelists for their time and for their points of views. And I guess what I'd like to just remind all of us, I'm thinking about the 10th, 20th, 50th anniversary classes, I'm thinking about, or 25th and 50th anniversary classes rather, I'm sorry, thinking about 1970. 1970 was, we were in the throes of the Vietnam War. That was the U.S. incursion into Cambodia. There were I won't even talk about the South Asian crisis. So that was another time in this world where we were we found ourselves kind of on crises on multiple fronts. And in 1995, I recall just the breakup of former Yugoslavia, and all these questions, all these things that we had put to bed as never again moments became kind of leads on the evening news. So I think it reminded us of just the cyclical aspect of kind of much of global politics, international relations, as well as domestic crises that spill over sovereign borders. And now we find ourselves, I think, possibly on the one hand, we can see ourselves as this is a moment that is, testing the world on just so many different dimensions. On the other hand, as Devesh laid out, I think really, really nicely, it really does, depending on how things go in early November, as an opportunity to learn, not only learn from the lessons, the hard lessons that the world has hopefully internalized, but also to operationalize the solutions and the ways forward, to build upon them, to address the fissures and the contradictions that COVID has laid bare, and move on to a world that will not be free of conflict or tension, but hopefully one that privileges or that focuses on tensions that happen spontaneously or through idiosyncratic reasons, rather than as a result of kind of unforeseen consequences or of conscious decisions that were not thought through to their logical conclusion. So, with that soapbox sermon out of the way, I want to thank again our panelists. I want to thank everybody who's been working so hard on making this event a reality. It's been a real privilege to be able to be part of it. And I will now turn the microphone back over to Christina.
Hi, Andy, and I just want to extend another thank you to our panelists. You all always do an amazing job of showing up and providing us with really great takes and content for our reunion programming, so thank you. It appears that we do not at this time have any questions from the audience. So Andy, I know that there were a few pre-submitted questions from reunion attendees. I'll give you the opportunity to answer those. We want to be respectful of Carla's time as well. I know she has to depart us early, so thank you so much for joining us. But we'll take those 1 or 2 questions that were pre-submitted, Andy, and then we will conclude. One quick announcement for our attendees. We will be taking a break after this panel, but we will be coming back to our second Zoom, which will be the social component of today's activity. So our 50th class presentation and also our class social breakouts, where you all will receive personalized individual Zoom links that will be emailed out to you. So again, I'll mute myself. I'll turn it back over to Andy to address those 2 or 3 questions if time allows us, and then we will take our break.
Okay, thanks so much, Christina. There are a number of wonderful questions, and so I'm going to try to, some of which we've covered either directly or laterally from some of the questions that we've already asked. Let me. This is I think it's an excellent question, and it takes us out of the realm of, say, policy per se, and it's a bit of a normative question. But since we ended on a slightly normative note, I think it's a great way for us to move into this section. And so the question is, what is the cost in terms of leadership and ethical prestige of the last 4 years of US withdrawal from international organizations? I know that Carla needs to leave soon. So do you have time to give a quick response to this, or not really?
I apologize, but that's a big one, and I don't think I have time. And so I think I will make a graceful exit now, if I may, or not so graceful, maybe.
Thank you so much, Carla. Really, really appreciate it. Great to see you. Safe travels and see you soon. So Lisel,
Sure.
There you go. I'm sorry. Sorry, you just people moved around on the. So, do you want me to repeat the question, or?
No, I think it's a great question, and I think it gets to all kinds of questions of international relations that we study, including normative questions, as well as analytical questions. And I think a lot of the response to that depends on sort of grand strategy and how you view the U.S. role in the world, and whether you think the U.S. should be more involved or less involved. Which is highly debated these days. I think one of the things that stands out to me the most, and this is going to, I think, reveal a little bit of my my own approach to politics, is that while I don't think that the U.S. should be playing any kind of world policeman role or should be sort of the, you know, hegemonic rule setter in those senses, you know, I do think that it can play a very important role. And I think what has happened is that not only has it abdicated its leadership role, but it's abdicated its partnership role. And that's what I think is really important, in the sense that, you know, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, pulling out of the JCPOA, you know, criticizing NATO and, you know, questioning whether or not the US should even be a part of it. That's all, you know, indicative of President Trump's approach to politics and international relations, which has to do with economic nationalism, trade wars, and primacy. And that is something that I think has major international consequences, as Devesh very rightly, you know, alluded to earlier. I think that the Trump administration and President Trump himself is also indicative of a wider trend of what I call hyper-masculine nationalist populist strongmen that rule their countries and you know, dictate their foreign policies in particular ways. And I think that for the United States, for US democracy, for the US to be a useful and engaging partner in, you know, in the NATO alliance, in global politics more strongly, you need to have an individual that listens to the intelligence community. You need to have an individual that believes in science. You need to have an individual who, you know, governs for the entire population, not just a particular section of the population, not an individual who uses extraordinarily polarizing rhetoric to marginalize anybody who's opposed to them. So I think that, you know, under the Trump administration, because we're not quite at the 4 years mark yet, but under the Trump administration, you've seen this very rapid transformation that I think is extraordinarily important to acknowledge. And I've been on alumni panels. I've been on a number of different panels where I've listened to people say that American democratic institutions are extraordinarily resilient and we have nothing to worry about. And I think that that leads to a sense of complacency that we don't have the right and we don't have the privilege to enjoy, because the US is not immune to de-democratization or populism or nationalism. And the idea that, you know, voter suppression and all that kind of stuff can't happen here is false, because it has been happening for Black and brown populations for decades and decades, but it's also the case that it's happening here now. So I think the ethical questions are extremely important ones, both for domestic politics and for international relations as well.
Well, and just to sound like a secular social scientist for a moment, I mean, this is really the hypothesis that we're testing, you know, and so this is, you know, this is a, you know, I think this really is potentially a tectonic plate shift, and the question is, which way is it going to shift? If it is going to shift, which way is it going to? Devesh, same question to you.
So sorry, Andy, if I understood you right, you know, it's about sort of US leadership going forward. I think there are three components here. One is to what degree will, and I think it's likely that if you have a new administration, will it rejoin some of the key multilateral treaties, organizations like the TPP, the Climate Change Accord, and the WHO. I think that is likely. I don't know about the TPP, but the other two for sure. And it'll give the US, you know, some momentum going forward. However, I think not just the Trump administration, going back at least about 10 to 20 years, US has been trying to exert global leadership on the cheap. If you compare the resources China has put into BRI and compare what the US has been doing, it's a pittance. The US took the leadership post World War II because it was willing to put in enormous resources like the Marshall Plan. Now it wants to lead, but it wants to lead on the cheap. And that's, China has seen that game, and it's willing to put in much more money than the US is. So the US will have to rethink that. And the third, I think, and this I think is actually much harder, is trust in the US. I think people here just don't realize, yes, countries around the world don't trust China, but they also don't trust the US. If China today decided to take action on Taiwan, do people really believe or trust that the US will actually do much? Do the Koreans, the Japanese, the Indians really believe that if China really launched something strongly against them, what the US would be willing to risk? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that people trust the US. That's a much harder battle to fight, and it's going to be much harder for the US to rebuild that trust.
Sorry, trying to find my unmute button. I mean, I think those are all excellent points. And in fact, I'm probably going to get in trouble for doing this because I don't want to shill for anybody. But on Devesh's second point in particular about the US trying to do things on the cheap, the book that I'm reading right now is a book by former SAIS Director of China Studies, Mike Lampton, called Rivers of Iron. And it goes into really, really deep detail into the degree to which China is not only putting its mouth, but its money into its infrastructure development of the region, in this case, Southeast Asia. And it really underscores the asymmetries by which China and the United States are approaching this era of potential competition. So I think that that's a really, really important point, and I hope people do take that away. We do have time for a lightning round, maybe of one last question, and there's so many good questions here, but this is one that I think we've touched upon, but not really honed in on, and I'd like to hear maybe if we could keep it to a minute and a half, 2 minutes from each of you. How would the decline of globalization affect foreign assistance to developing countries? And so, Lisel, I know this is I'm putting you on the spot here, but I'm putting you on the spot.
Okay, that's fine. How would the decline of globalization affect foreign assistance to developing countries? Is the question?
So I mean, the times that we find ourselves in.
This is a very secular political scientist response, but I understand those two not to be causal, but to be definitive of another. I think foreign development assistance is a part of globalization, and so I don't necessarily see one as affecting or contributing to the other, because I feel like one is subsumed within the other. I mean, I think that if you think about maybe just the decline of foreign assistance in general, one of the things that I mentioned at the start in terms of economic trends that have been reversed by the pandemic, one of them was the poverty alleviation. And that's something that I think has really suffered under the pandemic. But this may be, if we think about the economic consequences, we think about the rise of economic nationalism that was already happening under populists. You see the rise of economic nationalism in response to COVID and the need to focus on developing one's own economy. That, I would think, is logically linked to not necessarily increasing foreign aid to other countries. But I think it's also important for people to recognize, talk about doing things on the cheap, how little, what small percentage of US GDP is foreign assistance. And it's less than 1%. And not a lot of Americans know that. So there may be a retrenchment of foreign assistance and kind of a focus on getting our own house in order post-pandemic that I think would affect foreign assistance. But again, it's hard for me to kind of separate processes of globalization and processes of foreign assistance, because foreign assistance is a diplomacy effort. It has to do with national security. It has to do with normative beliefs about how we should spend our money. But it's part and parcel of kind of the increased interconnections of countries around the world.
Thanks very much, Lisel. Devesh.
So foreign assistance, or what we call ODA, or official development assistance, has broadly been flat. It's a tiny fraction. It's about 1% of the US budget, and a small decimal point of US GDP. There is no evidence that ODA matters for broader economic growth. It matters for certain very specific purposes, and we might see a combined effort, say, like for global health and for vaccine distribution. I think countries, rich countries can play a much greater role in helping poor countries through a variety of other means other than ODA. Even if they just open up their borders a little more to temporary labor migration, remittances are much higher than ODA. It's a form of self-help for poor countries. Their workers go and work and send back money like to their families. If they open up their borders to trade, to goods supplied by poor countries, and poor countries face a lot of trade barriers in rich countries, those efforts can be much more helpful to developing countries. They can just a capital increase for the World Bank, a quota increase for the IMF will allow multilateral institutions to extend much more financial assistance to poor countries. Those sorts of things, I think, will go a much further way than simply ODA, and ODA is simply not going to increase.
Thank you very much, Devesh. And on that, I would argue, positive and prescriptive note, I want to thank our panelists once again. I want to thank all the people working behind the scenes to make this possible. And I want to once again congratulate all of the members of the classes of 1970, 1995, and 2010. Thank you so much for joining us. And it's been a real pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you. And hopefully you'll be able to think about and take some of these ideas and wrestle with them and pass them on and push back and do all the things that you did when you were students at SAIS in the confidence, knowing that we are continuing to do the work that that makes SAIS so unique and so special. So again, thank you so very much.
And again, thank you so much to Professors Kapur and Hintz and Freeman, who is no longer here with us, and Andy, or Dean Mertha, I should say, for moderating what was a really great and amazing conversation today.